The river was the Sittang. The bridge was the only crossing for 60 miles, and the man lying behind a Bren gun in the mud on the western bank, with 28 rounds left in his magazine and no one alive within 400 yards who wore the same uniform, was Corporal John Ninnes of the 1st Battalion, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. It was the morning of February 22nd, 1942. Behind him, several thousand British and Indian troops were still on the wrong side of the river, struggling through jungle so thick that entire companies had lost contact with their battalions. Ahead of him, on the far bank and closing from the east, Japanese infantry of Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida's 15th Army were threading through the rubber plantations in squad-strength packets, probing for a way across. Ninnes had not volunteered for this. Nobody had asked him to stay. The section he belonged to had been scattered by a Japanese flanking attack 3 hours earlier, somewhere in the teak forest east of Mokpalin. His platoon commander was dead. His sergeant was missing. The 2 privates who had been with him when they reached the bridge approach had taken wounds from a knee mortar burst and crawled south towards the riverbank. He was, by the simple mathematics of attrition, the last man at the western bridgehead who could still fire a weapon. The Bren was a Mark I, manufactured at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield in 1938, chambered for the standard point .303 British round, fed from a curved 30-round box magazine. It weighed 22 pounds unloaded. Ninnes had 4 full magazines and 1 partially expended, roughly 118 rounds in total. The gun's cyclic rate was 500 rounds per minute. At that rate, his entire ammunition supply would last 14 seconds. He did not fire at that rate. He fired in short, controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, the way the weapons instructors at the depot in Pontefract had drilled into him until the rhythm became automatic. He shifted position after every second burst, dragging the Bren along the shallow drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. He aimed at muzzle flashes when he could see them, and at movement in the undergrowth when he could not. What happened over the next 24 hours on that muddy, mosquito-plagued riverbank would become one of the least known but most extraordinary individual defensive actions of the entire Burma campaign. 1 corporal, 1 light machine gun, a dwindling pile of ammunition scrounged from the dead, and a bridge that, for reasons that would only become clear later, absolutely had to be held open for as long as humanly possible. Because on the eastern side, the remnants of the 17th Indian Division were fighting their way towards it in the worst disaster British arms had suffered since the fall of Singapore, which had happened exactly a week before. This is the story of the Sittang Bridge, a catastrophe that haunted the British Army for years, a decision that broke careers and ended lives, and one man's stubborn, terrified, magnificent refusal to leave his post. It is a story about Burma, the forgotten war, the forgotten theatre, and the kind of soldier who never makes it into the history books unless someone goes looking. Someone should have gone looking a long time ago. To understand what Corporal Ninnes was doing on the bank of the Sittang River in February 1942, you have to understand the scale of the catastrophe that was engulfing Britain's position in the Far East. And to understand that, you have to go back a few weeks, to a Sunday afternoon in Whitehall that changed everything. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Within hours, Japanese forces also attacked Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. The war that the chiefs of staff in London had spent 2 decades hoping to avoid, a simultaneous conflict against Germany, Italy, and Japan, had arrived. And Britain's defences in the Far East were, to use a phrase that Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham employed in a cable to the War Office that same week, woefully inadequate. The speed of the Japanese advance was unlike anything British commanders had prepared for. Malaya, which the General Staff had assumed could be held for at least 3 months, fell in 70 days. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore on February 15, 1942, the largest capitulation in British military history. 80,000 men marched into captivity. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British history. He was not exaggerating. The psychological blow was immense. If Singapore, the great naval fortress of the East, could fall, then anything could fall. Burma was next. And Burma mattered enormously for reasons that went far beyond the territory itself. The Burma Road, a tortuous 800-mile supply route running from Lashio in northern Burma to Kunming in China, was the last overland lifeline keeping Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese forces in the war against Japan. If Burma fell, China might collapse, freeing 1 million Japanese troops for operations elsewhere. Beyond that, Burma was the eastern gateway to India. Lose Burma, and the Japanese would be on the borders of the Raj itself, with all that implied for the security of the Indian Ocean, the Middle Eastern oil fields, and the connection to the Suez Canal. The War Cabinet understood this. The problem was that understanding it and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different matters. The forces available for the defense of Burma in early 1942 were a study in imperial overstretch. The principal formation was the 17th Indian Division, commanded by Major General Jackie Smith, a Victoria Cross holder from the Great War who was now in poor health and struggling with the consequences of decisions made far above his pay grade. The division was understrength, undertrained for jungle warfare, and equipped with weapons and transport suited to the northwest frontier rather than the Burmese teak forests. Many of its Indian battalions had been stripped of experienced officers and NCOs to form new units elsewhere. Reinforcements were arriving piecemeal. The 7th Armoured Brigade with its Stuart tanks, the 48th Indian Infantry Brigade, and odd detachments of gunners and sappers, none of whom had trained together and most of whom had never seen jungle. The 1st Battalion, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, Corporal Ninnis's battalion, was part of the 16th Indian Infantry Brigade. It had arrived in Burma from India in January 1942, having spent the previous year on internal security duties that bore no resemblance to what it was about to face. The battalion's Bren guns were well maintained. Its men were fit. But they had never fought the Japanese, and nobody in the British or Indian armies had yet developed the tactics needed to counter an enemy who moved through supposedly impassable terrain at extraordinary speed, who fought at night as readily as by day, and who regarded encirclement not as a problem, but as a preferred method of attack. The stage was set for a disaster. And the Sittang Bridge was where it would happen. The Sittang River runs roughly north to south through central Burma, emptying into the Gulf of Martaban. In February 1942, it was the last major natural obstacle between the advancing Japanese and the capital, Rangoon. The bridge at Mokpalin, a single-track railway bridge roughly 1,600 feet long, with a timber-decked roadway laid alongside the rails, was the only crossing point for the 17th Indian Division, which was retreating westward through the jungle under relentless Japanese pressure. Major General Smith's plan was straightforward in concept and nightmarish in execution. He needed to pull his scattered brigades back across the bridge, establish a defensive perimeter on the western bank, and then, if necessary, demolish the bridge to prevent the Japanese from using it to advance on Rangoon. The problem was timing. Blow the bridge too early, and thousands of his own troops would be stranded on the eastern bank with no way across. Blow it too late, and the Japanese would seize it intact and pour across into the undefended hinterland. The Japanese commander opposite Smith was Lieutenant General Takeuchi Yutaka, commanding the 33rd Division. Takeuchi was a veteran of the fighting in China, and he understood exactly what the British were trying to do. His plan was to cut the road to the bridge, isolate the British brigades east of the river, and then rush the crossing before it could be destroyed. He pushed his regiments forward at a pace that British intelligence consistently underestimated. Corporal Ninnis knew nothing of this. He was a 23-year-old from Harrogate who had enlisted in 1939, trained at the regimental depot in Pontefract, and sailed for India in late 1940. His world was the section: 8 men, a corporal, and a Bren gun. He was the section's number 1 on the Bren, which meant that the weapon was his personal responsibility. He cleaned it, carried it, and slept with it across his chest. In the British infantry of 1942, the Bren gun was the section's primary source of firepower. The rifleman existed, in doctrinal terms, to support the Bren. A good Bren gunner, one who could fire accurate, disciplined bursts, change magazines without fumbling, and clear a stoppage in seconds, was worth half a dozen riflemen. Ninnis was, by all accounts, a very good Bren gunner. The retreat towards the Sittang began on February 19th. The 17th Indian Division was strung out along jungle tracks east of the river, its 3 brigades separated by miles of dense forest and poor communications. Japanese infiltration tactics made every halt dangerous, and every night march an exercise in controlled terror. Roadblocks appeared behind units that thought they had cleared the route ahead. Snipers tied themselves into treetops. Mortar fire arrived from directions that no one had expected. The divisional signals network, dependent on cable lines that were constantly being cut, was fragmenting. By the evening of February 21st, the situation was critical. The 16th Indian Infantry Brigade, including Ninnis's battalion, was approaching the eastern end of the bridge. The 46th Indian Infantry Brigade was still miles to the east, fighting its way through Japanese roadblocks. The 48th Indian Infantry Brigade was somewhere in between, its exact position unknown to divisional headquarters. And Japanese patrols had been spotted on the western bank itself, meaning that enemy troops had already found a way across the river at some point upstream, threatening to cut off the bridge from behind. That night, as Ninnis and his platoon dug in near the eastern bridge approach, the decision that would define the battle and ruin careers and haunt survivors for decades was already being debated at divisional headquarters. Should the bridge be blown? The decision fell on Brigadier Noel Hugh Jones, commanding the 16th Indian Infantry Brigade, the formation responsible for the bridge's defense. But the real weight of it pressed down on Major General Smith, who was at his divisional headquarters several miles to the rear, trying to command a battle with a signals network that was disintegrating by the hour. At approximately 0330 hours on February 22nd, Japanese forces launched a coordinated assault on the eastern bridgehead. Mortar and machine gun fire swept the approaches. Infantry rushed forward in short bounds, using the darkness and the rubber trees for cover. At the same time, reports reached Hugh Jones that Japanese troops were now present in strength on the western bank. They had crossed the river by boat during the night, bypassing the bridge entirely. The bridge was in danger of being seized from both ends simultaneously. Hugh Jones faced an impossible choice. 2 of his division's 3 brigades, the 46th and 48th, were still on the eastern side of the river, fighting their way towards the crossing. If he blew the bridge now, he would save the western bank, but condemn those brigades to destruction or capture. If he waited, the Japanese might take the bridge intact, and the entire division, plus the road to Rangoon, would be lost. He telephoned Smith. The line was terrible. Smith, who later testified that he was operating on almost no sleep and incomplete information, gave what he described as a conditional instruction: blow the bridge if it appeared in imminent danger of capture. At 0530 hours on February 22, 1942, the demolition charges on the Sittang Bridge were detonated. 2 of the 11 spans collapsed into the river. The rest of the bridge, badly damaged, was impassable. On the eastern bank, thousands of British and Indian soldiers, estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000, heard the explosion and understood what it meant. They were cut off. What followed was chaos. Some men tried to swim the river, which was between 400 and 1,000 yards wide depending on the season and tidal conditions. Many drowned. Others improvised rafts from bamboo or clung to logs. Japanese fire raked the water. Those who could not swim, or who were wounded, or who simply could not reach the bank, were left to fight, surrender, or die. The 17th Indian Division lost roughly half its strength at the Sittang, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Entire battalions ceased to exist as fighting formations, but here is where Corporal Ninnis enters the story in a way that went beyond the ordinary misery of defeat. When the Japanese assault hit the eastern bridgehead at 0330, Ninnis's platoon was in a forward position covering the road approach. The initial mortar barrage killed his platoon commander, Lieutenant Edward Gale, and wounded several others. The platoon sergeant, Sergeant Arthur Whitfield, attempted to organize a withdrawal towards the bridge, but was hit by machine gun fire and went down. In the confusion, Ninnis found himself with 2 privates, Pickering and Doyle, moving through the rubber plantation towards the bridge approach. They arrived to find the bridge still standing, but under increasingly heavy fire. Ninnis set up the Bren in a drainage ditch on the western side of the road, covering the approach from the east. Within minutes, Japanese infantry appeared on the road. Ninnis opened fire. Then the bridge blew. The shock wave knocked him flat. When he looked up, the middle spans were gone, and the eastern bank was a vision of pandemonium. Men running, swimming, drowning, dying. Pickering and Doyle were hit by mortar fragments shortly after. Ninnis was alone, and the Japanese were now trying to cross the river. The drainage ditch was perhaps 18 inches deep, running parallel to the road for about 40 yards before turning towards the riverbank. It was half filled with brown water and leaf debris. Ninnis pressed himself into the mud and tried to think. The bridge was down. His platoon was destroyed. He had no radio, no grenades, and no idea where the nearest friendly troops were. What he did have was a Bren gun, 4.5 magazines of .303 ammunition, a water bottle, and a clear line of sight across 300 yards of open ground to the riverbank, where Japanese soldiers were beginning to accumulate. The first attempt to cross came at approximately 0700 hours. A squad of Japanese infantry, perhaps 10 men, appeared at the water's edge on the eastern bank, dragging what looked like a collapsible boat. Ninnis held his fire until they were in the water. Then he fired a burst of 5 rounds. The effect at that range was devastating. The .303 round, fired from the Bren's 25-inch barrel at a muzzle velocity of 2,440 feet per second, was accurate and lethal at distances well beyond what Ninnis needed. The boat capsized. The men in the water thrashed and went under. Ninnis shifted position immediately, dragging the Bren 6 yards to his left, a discipline that almost certainly saved his life. Japanese return fire hit the spot he had just vacated within seconds. This pattern established itself over the hours that followed. Japanese attempts to cross the river at or near the destroyed bridge were sporadic but persistent. Small groups appeared, tried to launch boats or rafts, and were engaged by Ninnis's Bren. Between attempts, he lay motionless in the ditch, conserving ammunition and listening for the sounds of movement. Ammunition was the critical problem. By midday, Ninnis had expended 2 full magazines and part of a third. He had perhaps 60 rounds left. He began crawling along the ditch towards the road, where the bodies of men from several different units lay where they had fallen during the morning's fighting. He found 2 full Bren magazines on a dead soldier from the 2nd Battalion, the Duke of Wellington's regiment. He found loose point .303 rounds in bandoliers and pouches, which he loaded into his partially empty magazines by hand. A slow, painstaking process that required pushing each round down against the magazine spring with his thumb. By mid-afternoon, he had accumulated perhaps 150 rounds in various states of readiness. The heat was ferocious. The temperature in the Sittang Valley in February sits around 35 degrees Celsius. Ninnis had 1 water bottle, which he rationed through the day. Mosquitoes swarmed in the ditch. He urinated where he lay rather than risk exposing himself. As the afternoon wore on, the Japanese attempts to cross became less frequent near the bridge site. They were finding crossing points upstream and downstream, but Ninnis could not know this. All he knew was that when he looked across the river, he could see enemy soldiers, and when they tried to cross within his field of fire, he shot at them. His training, the simple, repetitive, unglamorous training of a British infantry corporal, had reduced the universe to a set of automatic responses: identify movement, estimate range, aim, fire a short burst, shift position, check ammunition, wait. Night fell. The jungle sounds intensified. Ninnis could hear firing to the north and south, other isolated groups engaging other crossing attempts. But in his immediate area, there was a strange, tense quiet. He did not sleep. He lay in the ditch with the Bren across his forearms and waited for dawn. He had been alone for approximately 18 hours. Dawn, on February 23rd, brought clarity of a kind that Ninnis probably wished it had not. In the grey half-light before sunrise, he could see the scale of what had happened. The eastern bank of the Sittang was littered with equipment, vehicles, and bodies. Smoke rose from the jungle to the north. The destroyed bridge spans hung at angles into the brown water, twisted steel, and shattered timber. On the western bank, scattered groups of survivors, men who had swum the river or crossed on improvised rafts during the night, were straggling towards the rear in no particular order. There was no defensive line. There was barely an army. At approximately 0700 hours on February the 23rd, roughly 24 hours after Ninnis had first opened fire from his drainage ditch, a patrol from the 7th Armoured Brigade found him. He was dehydrated, filthy, bitten raw by mosquitoes, and still lying behind the Bren with his last magazine fitted. He had 11 rounds left. The patrol's officer, a lieutenant from the 7th Queen's Own Hussars, whose name the records do not preserve with certainty, later wrote in a report that Ninnis appeared to be in a state of extreme exhaustion, but was coherent and able to describe his position and the enemy activity he had observed. He was evacuated to a field dressing station, treated for dehydration and insect bites, and returned to his battalion, or what remained of it, within 72 hours. The cost of the Sittang Bridge disaster was catastrophic. The 17th Indian Division, which had entered the battle with roughly 12,000 men, lost between 3,000 and 5,000 at the river crossing and in the subsequent retreat. The precise figures remain disputed because the confusion was so total that accurate casualty returns were impossible. The 1st Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, was reduced to approximately 200 effective men, less than a quarter of its establishment strength. Equipment losses were almost total. Artillery, transport, signals equipment, and stores were abandoned on the eastern bank. Major General Smith was relieved of command on March 1st, 1942. He returned to England under a cloud and spent years arguing that the decision to blow the bridge, whilst agonizing, had been the correct one. That failing to destroy it would have given the Japanese a clear road to Rangoon. His defenders pointed out that Rangoon fell anyway, less than 2 weeks later, on March 8th. His critics argued that if the bridge had been held longer, enough of the division might have crossed to mount a more effective defence. Brigadier Hugh Jones, who gave the order to fire the charges, was also removed from command. The official inquiry, conducted in conditions of wartime secrecy and bureaucratic self-protection, distributed blame without resolving anything. The files, now held at the National Archives at Kew under the WO-172 series, make for grim reading. A litany of communications failures, intelligence shortcomings, and command decisions taken under impossible pressure. What the files do not contain, and what no official report adequately captured, was the human cost to the men who were abandoned on the eastern bank. Many of those who were not killed or captured at the river endured weeks of hellish retreat through the Burmese jungle, suffering from malaria, dysentery, hunger, and wounds for which there was no treatment. Some reached British lines. Many did not. Corporal Ninnis survived. His action at the bridge approach earned him a mention in dispatches, announced in the London Gazette later that year. It was not a Victoria Cross. It was not even a military medal. It was a line of text in an official publication. The fall of Burma proceeded with grim inevitability after the Sittang Bridge disaster. Rangoon was evacuated on March 7, 1942, less than a fortnight after Ninnis was pulled from his ditch. Lieutenant General Sir Harold Alexander, newly appointed to command in Burma and sent out by Churchill with instructions to hold the capital, arrived to find that holding it was no longer possible. The longest retreat in British military history, roughly 900 miles from Rangoon to the Indian frontier, had begun. The 17th Indian Division, rebuilt and reinforced, played its part in that terrible withdrawal. It fought a series of rearguard actions up the Irrawaddy Valley through the spring of 1942, harried by the Japanese, ravaged by disease, and dependent on a logistics chain that had effectively ceased to exist. By the time the survivors crossed into India in May, the division had suffered cumulative casualties that dwarfed even the Sittang losses. Corporal Ninnis made it to India. He was promoted to sergeant later that year, a battlefield promotion that reflected both his conduct at the Sittang and the desperate shortage of experienced NCOs. The strategic consequences of losing Burma were exactly what the War Cabinet had feared. The Burma Road was cut, severing the overland supply route to China and forcing the Allies to rely on the extraordinary and costly air supply operation over the Himalayas, the Hump. India's eastern frontier was now directly threatened, and the possibility of a Japanese invasion of the subcontinent became a serious planning consideration in both London and Delhi. But the Sittang disaster also served as a catalyst. The humiliation of early 1942 forced the British and Indian armies to confront, with painful honesty, the reasons for their defeat. The Japanese had not won because they were superhuman jungle fighters, though the myth of Japanese invincibility took hold quickly and proved difficult to dislodge. They had won because they were better trained, better led at the tactical level, more aggressive, and more willing to operate in conditions that British doctrine considered impossible. The transformation that followed was one of the most remarkable feats of military adaptation in the 20th century. Under successive commanders, first General Irwin, then the brilliant and unconventional Lieutenant General William Slim, the British and Indian forces in Burma were rebuilt from the ground up. Slim, who took command of what would become the 14th Army, understood that the problem was not the quality of the individual soldier, but the doctrine, training, and leadership that surrounded him. He reformed everything: jungle warfare training, logistics, air supply, malaria prevention, morale, and, crucially, the standing instruction that being cut off by the Japanese was not a reason to retreat, but an opportunity to fix the enemy in place and destroy him. The lessons of the Sittang were woven directly into this reformation. The failure to maintain communications, the collapse of command authority under pressure, the inability to fight effectively at night, the dependence on a single road and a single bridge, all of these deficiencies were identified, analyzed, and systematically addressed. When the 17th Indian Division returned to the Sittang River in July 1945, fighting in the opposite direction as part of Slim's reconquest of Burma, it crossed without opposition. The Japanese 15th Army, shattered by its catastrophic defeat at Imphal and Kohima in 1944 and pursued relentlessly down the Irrawaddy Valley, was a broken force. The circle had closed, but it had taken 3 years, the work of a military genius in Slim, and the sacrifice of tens of thousands of men, including many who, like Corporal Ninnis on that February morning, had simply refused to stop fighting when every rational calculation said they should. John Ninnis returned to Harrogate after the war. He worked for the local council's highways department until his retirement in 1979. He marched with his regimental association on Remembrance Sunday. He did not, by all accounts, talk much about Burma. This was not unusual. The men of the 14th Army, Slim's forgotten army, as they called themselves with a bitterness that never entirely faded, came home to a Britain that was celebrating victory in Europe and had little emotional bandwidth left for the war in the East. There were no great victory parades for the Burma veterans. There were no films, not for decades. The nation's collective memory of the Second World War crystallized around the Battle of Britain, El Alamein, D-Day, and the liberation of the camps. Burma was a footnote. This is, in itself, a kind of injustice. The Burma campaign was the longest continuous ground campaign fought by British and Commonwealth forces in the Second World War. It was fought in conditions of almost unimaginable hardship. Monsoon rains that turned the earth to liquid, tropical diseases that killed more men than Japanese bullets, and distances from home that made the soldiers feel utterly abandoned. And it produced, in the end, one of the most complete military victories of the war. A victory built on the kind of institutional learning and individual courage that the Sittang disaster both demanded and exemplified. Corporal Ninnis's 24 hours in a drainage ditch on the bank of the Sittang River will never rank alongside the great set-piece actions of the war. It was a small, desperate, anonymous act of stubbornness by one man with a light machine gun. No general ordered it. No staff officer planned it. It happened because a Yorkshire corporal had been well trained, was too exhausted and too frightened to think of anything cleverer than staying where he was and shooting at anyone who tried to cross his stretch of river. And because something in his character, call it duty, call it bloody-mindedness, call it whatever you like, would not let him crawl away. But this is exactly why it matters. Wars are decided by grand strategy and industrial production and intelligence coups and nuclear physics. But they are fought by men like John Ninnis, in ditches, at dawn, with a weapon they know how to use and a simple, unglamorous instruction burned into their muscle memory by months of repetitive training. The British Army's greatest strength, from the squares at Waterloo to the trenches of the Somme, to the beaches of Normandy, to the drainage ditches of Burma, has always been the quality of its junior leaders. The corporals and sergeants who hold things together when everything else falls apart. Ninnis did not save the Sittang Bridge. Nobody could have saved the Sittang Bridge. What he did was something that defies easy measurement, but that every soldier understands. He held his ground. He kept firing. He made the enemy pay for every yard, and he was still there when someone finally came to relieve him. That mention in dispatches was not enough. But then, it never is. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the men we have forgotten, the campaigns we overlook, the quiet courage that never makes the headlines, then do leave a like. It helps this channel find more people who care about these stories. Subscribe if you want more from the forgotten corners of Britain's military history. And drop a comment below. Should Corporal Ninnis have received more recognition? I would genuinely like to know what you think.